else is going to be using this office?
Right, I only work 3 days a week, and so there's a colleague who comes in 1 day a week.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then we're good to go then. And then, yeah, you can just
Okay.
ask questions.
Well, you can start by saying who you are, and then just for your connection with New Bolt. What do you remember, or how it all started?
Mhm. Yeah. I'm Jerry Hoyle, and I'm now a clinical psychologist. I have a practice in Redlands, California, near Loma Linda University. Newbold College was most certainly the most memorable year of my college experience. It all happened when I was a sophomore at Southern Missionary College in those days. And a previous roommate had been to Newbold the year before, had excellent experience, fascinating stories to tell. And so I just felt like that sounds like a worthwhile way to spend your year. Some of us that talked about going at the same time from Southern felt like the South, where we mostly all grew up, North Carolina, some of us were from Georgia, Tennessee. My childhood in North Carolina was ideal. I wouldn't have changed it for anything, but it was also, it also didn't open my eyes up to many other kinds of experiences, cultures, and so on. So we said we think we should go abroad to avoid being narrow-minded. And that was our goal, and it ended up being exactly that. The year that I was there, my roommate was from Germany. There were cultures that I would have never been exposed to otherwise. And so it did end up broadening my horizon just on what kind of world you have to be able to relate to in order, if you're going to enter one of the service professions. I'd never imagined, for instance, that would be my future in terms of having to relate to a variety of cultures. But here in California, say currently, most of my clients are probably not American born. Many Asian families in the area, many Middle Eastern families, and I would have been poorly prepared to be able to understand some of those cultures, or at least accept some of those challenges. And I find that those are some of the families and individuals who actually trust me the most. And so I value that, and I think I give Newbold that kind of credit because I began to accept and value those kinds of relationships when I was there. At the time, I was actually a theology major at Newbold. There weren't any behavioral science courses, actually. There were only 2 behavioral science courses at Southern as well at the time. So mental health as a field was, sort of unknown. It wouldn't have been one of our options. I found my way into mental health in, you might say, a somewhat circuitous route. I finished my bachelor's in theology, and I pastored as a youth pastor for 3 years in California. But I, in doing so, began to enjoy the idea of teaching secondary in secondary education. So I came to Loma Linda as the Bible teacher at Loma Linda Academy soon after moving to California. Finished my graduate degree not in theology but in secondary education. So I had a subject emphasis in religion and psychology. In the process, I developed an interest in graduate school. I met a person you might call a mentor at my church where I was youth pastor, who was a psychologist and had also been a theology major. And he opened up what you might say a vision or a new paradigm, so to speak, of integrating mental health with religion, with spirituality. And I thought that seemed just sort of like a perfect calling. My parents had worked in mental health, both of them, growing up. And so that began to sort of plant the idea of becoming a psychologist that used spiritual resources for people where that was important for them as a way of serving. And so that led to then graduate school here in California, where I earned a PhD in clinical psychology, did a postdoctoral internship in the Department of Psychiatry here after I graduated, and stayed ever since. The interesting thing about how a person finds their way, I guess if I were to be a mentor or were to speak with someone who was kind of deciding, how do I get from being a student at Newbold to doing something like I'm doing or anything else, I really feel like all of those experiences have ended up being a rich and valuable combination, because people in this community value very much having a Christian psychologist, someone who values their faith and utilizes that in a healthy sort of way, in working with them. So it's like reassuring young people, none of these experiences are wasted, They really all can come together in a very special way if service or health care or something of that sort is what you want to do. And I'm needing some new direction.
Can you tell us a fun story or something that you can remember from Newbold as a student?
Yeah. So as I said, Newbold was my most memorable college experience. The things that I still remember from those days was the opportunity at the time to hitchhike to London. There was no M4. It was the Great London Road, I suppose, or I don't remember. But in any case, it meant going through the little, towns on the way into London, hitchhiking when you could get a ride, or maybe at least hitchhiking to get close enough where you would get a train station that then you could go on in by train. Probably one of the most poignant memories I have was a Sunday morning with a couple of friends hitchhiking in. It was a bit rainy, kind of dreary, drizzly, and we heard church bells ringing in the village. It wasn't noon, it wasn't church time. Seemed a little bit, unusual. And a lady came walking by, a typical little English lady, older lady, and we noticed that she was crying. And she came by and she says, "Mr. Churchill has just died," which was really a passing of an era. And to be there at that time seemed just very poignant. We later on went in, filed through, I think he lay in state in St. Paul's, but I'm not sure, but I know he was buried at Westminster probably. And rainy day, terribly windy, cold, and the line was around the block, way down the street, hour and a half, waiting to file through. It's a very solemn kind of occasion, very, very poignant memory. Some other memories, hilarious. I can't claim that I did this, but I stood by and observed it with great amusement, because Americans had a bit of a reputation of being adventurous, maybe even foolhardy, and at spring break, some of the guys, I think it was about 4 guys, decided that it would be a great adventure to take canoes to the headwaters of the Thames and canoe the entire length of the Thames to the ocean. And someone agreed to haul the canoes up there. I don't know how much they had checked this out, but as it turns out, the headwaters of the Thames is a marsh in the middle of some cow pasture. And so where they put the canoes in, there's no way you could paddle. At that point, they had to wade through marsh and muck for quite a ways, ducking under barbed wire fences and so on, before they ever got to the place where the canoes could actually float and they could begin to paddle. But they still had to be ducking under barbed wire, and so on to get through it all. When you notice, when the Thames comes through, say, a little village, they might have a canal, and it gets sort of narrow through the bridges and so on until it gets through the village, and then it spreads out into the pastures again. So in the village, one of these canoes in the canal got wedged between a bridge. It was so sideways like that it got wedged in the bridge, and the current flipped the canoe over and dumped everything they had in the water. One canoe got through okay, so there was a group of guys who were dry and had everything okay, but then there were the other guys whose sleeping bags were all wet, and all their clothes were wet. So they drug the canoes out on the other side of town in the cow pasture, and began to try to figure out what were they going to do to spend the night, because they only had 2 sleeping bags that were dry among 4 people. So the one group did decide that they would loan the other 2 fellas 1 sleeping bag, but they had no clothes. And so they spent their night together in 1 sleeping bag, without the benefit of any pajamas, of course. They found even their money, their shoes, everything was drenched. So they built a fire, and they used some sticks to prop their around the campfire, and they put all of their clothing on the sticks and their boots around the fire to kind of see if they could dry things out overnight. And when they got up in the morning, they looked around the campfire and there was nothing, because the sticks had all fallen into the fire, burned up all of their clothes and their boots and most of their money. So they claimed that one of the two of them, they flipped a coin to see who would wrap himself in a sleeping bag and walk into town to buy some more clothes and shoes and so on. And eventually they went on their way and got into London and began to see that the tide was flowing in, and they were just rowing and rowing and were exhausted, but they weren't getting anywhere because the tide was pushing them back upriver. So they gave up before they got to the ocean, and found the church at the time owned a building in downtown London called the New Gallery Center, and it used to be like a large auditorium evangelistic center just off of Piccadilly. I mean, it was a great location. So the guys, we had been to that location several times. Somehow or other, they found a way to get in and spent the night in the New Gallery Center and called somebody at the college and came and picked up their canoes. But I mentioned to you before, there was a reputation, so to speak, of the ugly American, and you can imagine how those kinds of stories created the reputation, right? Other memorable experiences at the school. You know, I remember distinctly it probably being the most spiritual year of college experience. And, you know, it's hard to put your finger on how that was any different than any other school that I've been to, but it was. It clearly was one of the most spiritual years for me in terms of college life. It could be, in some ways, that the faculty and the administration really respected a student's right to make their own choices, for better or worse. There was a lot of freedom, actually, to make your own, you know, plans for, say, how you would spend the weekend or whatever. But there was always, you know, a morning worship in Salisbury Hall that guys went to. I don't remember if it was co-ed or not. I don't think it was. But guys that I'd gone to college with before who weren't particularly, you know, spiritual types who would keep it sort of private or to themselves or whatever. But these guys actually responded in somewhat the same way that I'm describing too. That they accepted it, they took it seriously, and really were, you know, different guys that as a result of that year. So the spiritual atmosphere, I would say, was probably one of the healthiest that I had. There were rules, but there were more principles than they were, you know, burdensome kinds of things that directed how you spent your day and your evening and your weekend and so forth. So that was a different experience for a lot of us. A lot of us had gone to boarding academies, colleges where they had a lot of prescriptive rules about, you know, what you could wear, couldn't wear, how you could fix your hair, whether or not you would have facial hair or not. I mean, Newbold wasn't that kind of experience. And suddenly it felt like they gave you more freedom, but what that also implied was more personal responsibility to make some of those decisions yourself. So we didn't see kind of rebellion as much as I'd experienced it in other school campuses. Academically, I'd also say too that Newbold was my most memorable year because just the British style of teaching, the British style of allowing a student to demonstrate what they had learned for the year. That was a very meaningful year because, well, for one, it developed quite a bit of self-discipline. You know, an academic work ethic is a bit unusual to see these days, I'll be honest. And I'm not sure that I had much of a work ethic when I went there, because again, the difference in style was I was used to maybe a frequent quiz, even a daily quiz. So it was pretty much externally driven, you know, my self-discipline or whatever I was reading or doing in terms of homework. And suddenly there weren't weekly quizzes or daily quizzes. There was maybe a midterm, possibly simply a final, where you would go to lecture, you would take notes, you would read the content, but at the end of the term, you'd walk in and they would hand you maybe even just a half sheet with 4 questions and say, choose 3 of the questions and sit down and tell me what you know about that, and you'd just sit down and start writing. And I found that to be the beginning of some self-discipline in how I paced my own study and how I prepared myself and so forth. Do we need to go in a different direction, or?
So that's brilliant so far.